At the time of recording, Jonathan Hickman's vision for the X-Men franchise has recently entered its second year, after having transitioned from the Dawn of X to the Reign of X era of stories. Throughout the many titles and publications from these X line of comics, many have alluded to and explicitly referenced elements laid out in the blueprints that Hickman had for the current era of mutantkind, House of X, and Powers of 10. And so, while his creative vision for Marvel's mutants isn't quite finished just yet, I did want to take the opportunity to look back and talk about some of my favorite elements from the HoX-PoX kickoff that launched this mutant renaissance. While House and Powers are meant to serve as two books that explore different facets of the same narrative, I tend to find myself gravitating the most towards Powers of 10 for its historiographical approach to storytelling. Powers of 10 serves as the unknown secret history of mutants in the Marvel Universe. And due to its focus on the history of this long-standing facet of Marvel's publication line, I've always felt that it allows the book to convey its story in a way that's so much more refreshing compared to the conventional comic book. By focusing on its wide-range timeline from year 1 to year 1000, Powers of 10 reframes the core characters of the X-Men within a larger context that Hickman clearly plans to explore. Throughout this given history, we see Charles Xavier meeting with Moira X to plant the seeds for the future of mutantkind, the establishment of the island of Krakoa as a sovereign nation on the global stage, the dystopian conflict between mutants, men, and machines, and an enigmatic glimpse into a post-humanity that has resented mutantkind so much that it sought to permanently bond itself with the same technology used to craft anti-mutant sentinels. It can all sound wildly convoluted if you're new to Hickman's style of storytelling, and his non-linear approach on the narrative doesn't help much either. But by giving the reader a broader look at the direction that these characters are headed towards, Powers of 10 introduces some of the central themes that Hickman's X-Men hope to explore, one of which being how technology shapes the future for both man as well as mutantkind. Powers of 10 makes it pretty clear in its first issue that the history that Hickman wants to focus on involves three main players to its core conflict: mankind, mutantkind, and machines. This is probably made most explicit in the year 100 era of mutant history, where we're given witness to the man-machine mutant war. With this first issue alone, Hickman hearkens and reasserts that the core of mutantkind's struggle for survival is not necessarily a conflict between mutant and man, but rather a more complicated triangle wherein mutants, men, and machines are all at each other's throats. This elevation of status for these technological titans, like the Sentinels and Nimrod, not only recognize the impact that these machines have had in the X-Men's history, but also expands upon the significance that technology as a whole have played in the systems of oppression that mutantkind has been left to endure. This attitude towards bots like the Sentinels really reframes a lot of the general attitudes that both Marvel's mutants, as well as most likely the reader, have had towards each appearance of these mechanized menaces across X-Men comics. For reference, going as far back as the Sentinels' first appearance in Uncanny X-Men number 14, the first story of the Sentinels from Stan Lee and Jack Kirby followed more of a Frankenstein's monster narrative trope. The mutant-hating anthropologist Bolivar Trask sees mutantkind as such a threat to humanity that he goes ahead and constructs the Sentinels as guardians and protectors for all of mankind, only to find out that his creations see mankind as so incapable that they instead require the cold and calculating authority of the Sentinels to corral and control them. The creation of the Sentinels by Lee and Kirby marks a landmark theme within the pages of Uncanny X-Men that would go on to lay a lot of the groundwork around what made comics about the mutants so different from other superhero titles. As according to pop culture analyst Joseph J. Dorowski in his textbook, Xmen and the Mutant Metaphor,
the Sentinels trilogy is the first story to fully engage with the idea of humanity fearing mutants and creating a genuine threat to the emerging class of powered individuals. A few issues earlier, number 5 and number 8, had shown normal humans fearing mutants, but this is the issue that most clearly cements fear, prejudice, and hatred as central themes of the X-Men. It may have taken a year to discover how to wed the ideas of mutants and prejudice together, but it was an idea Lee would continue to explore while writing the series, and one that would become the primary focus of the series after the 1975 relaunch.
The introduction of the Sentinels as a staple of the X-Men mythos saw their role in the mutant landscape as essentially tools of oppression from the bigoted and paranoid powers of mankind. And I really want to emphasize this idea of understanding robots like the Sentinels as tools, rather than self-actualized characters, as it's a framework that will help color a lot of the undertones and subtext that the X-Men series, as well as HoX-PoX, have lying underneath the surface. By thinking of these AI giants as tools of oppression and constructions of control, we're given the opportunity to liken them to real-world tools of oppression that have served to harm long-standing marginalized communities. With this lens in mind, it really colors the later eras of Powers of 10, particularly the year 1000 era, glimpsing into a future where mankind has abandoned humanity for the sake of assimilating their entire being with the very technology that was originally used to construct the same Sentinels that enforced their prejudiced attacks on mutantkind. And it's from this analysis that there's an argument to be made that Hickman's progression on the role technology plays over the course of human history in Powers of 10 can serve as a larger metaphorical progression in how the oppression of marginalized people escalates from being individual and confrontational instances of bigotry to more systemic and internalized societal ones. Gone are the days of simply using the Sentinels to keep mutantkind punished and controlled. And instead, we're given a glimpse into the future where mankind has indistinguishably bonded with the very tools they've used and are now able to simply corral all of mutantkind into a corner of their world to keep them in their place, all while separating them from the history and knowledge that their mutant culture helped cultivate. This allegory is made even more grim in the face of Moira X's own revelation on the inevitability of these technological titans in the pages of House of X number 2, when we're given the captions,
"Then, with blood on her hands and blood in her mouth, Moira learned the darkest truth of all her many lives regarding man's nightmare machines. Artificial intelligence is like fire. It's a discovery, not an invention. All she succeeded in doing was stopping a Trask from being the first man to burn their hand. Like mutants, the machines simply emerge at a certain point during societal and environmental evolution."
Whereas perhaps a reader could have initially dismissed the technological component of systemic oppression as being coincidence for the mutants, Moira's own conclusions from her experience repaint the metaphor as a more critical assertion that technology facilitates oppression instead, and serves as the core of her bleak thesis with Charles Xavier, when she comes to the fatalistic conclusion that mutantkind is almost destined to live in perpetual oppression and demise with the trajectory of human technological advancement. And in fact, the introduction of machine hyperintelligences like the Phalanx can seem really out of left field for the series, considering they don't have a clear relationship with the rest of the eras of mutantdom, or even the HoX-PoX as a whole. But through this lens of understanding technology as the evolution of the mechanization of systemic prejudice towards marginalized people, the ascension of post-humankind with the godlike advancement of the Phalanx can be read as a metaphorical demonstration on how systemic oppression perpetuates the inequalities it initially conceived. Homo Novissima is allowed to transcend and become one with a hyper-advanced civilization because of the technology they created to specifically persecute mutantkind. But mutantkind is divorced from this union by the fact that they have never been allowed to co-opt or reclaim the very technology that oppresses them. And we're given the narrative explanation that the Phalanx cannot absorb organic matter into its hive. And so, because of a discrimination that was established literally centuries ago, the echoes of this prejudice are compounded upon and amplified into the dystopia we see in the year 1000 era of the Xmen. Now, if I'm being honest, this is a bit of a generous metaphor to gleam from Powers of 10. Hickman doesn't show any explicit interest in exploring the mutant metaphor of prejudice and discrimination in his work, save for the thinly veiled excuse to radicalize Moira into what we see at the end of the series. But there's also the fact that this interpretation of the ascension of post-humanity is almost entirely undercut by a more subtle illusion that Hickman seeks to present the reader when post-humanity is visited by the supreme hive mind of the Phalanx. The final issue of Powers of 10 not only wraps up this logarithmic look into the secret history of mutantkind, but also shares what can seem at first as a very out-of-place scene with the reader during the year 1000 era of mutant history, wherein mutantkind is completely sidelined until the final issue of Powers of 10. And all we're given is a glimpse at a hyper-advanced civilization from post-humanity as it tries to make contact with other enigmatic, intelligent forces from beyond the stars. Seeing as how Hickman has worn his love for science fiction on his sleeve throughout the series, from the cover of Powers of 10 number 1, which is clearly evocative of the poster of the Star Wars films from the 70s, to the use of the Kardashev scale to classify the advanced entities that populate the Earth's future. And not to mention the countless references to many of the X-Men's sci-fi adventures from Claremont up to the 90s. It should all come as no surprise that the series ending for the year 1000 era of the X-Men is in fact another loose allusion to the work of pulp science fiction author Arthur C. Clarke and his novel Childhood's End. For a quick synopsis on the novel, Childhood's End tells the story of the extinction of the human race, but not in a way that you may expect. During the Cold War, humanity is visited by a race of advanced extraterrestrials called the Overlords, whose interactions and guidance help bring humanity to an advanced state of utopia and world peace. However, with time, the sense of peace among the human race eventually results in a generation of children who've evolved beyond the self-centered individualism of humanity and have grown to form a group consciousness through the development of telekinetic powers and a psychic, almost hive mind link with each other. This, the Overlords reveal, was their true purpose for coming to Earth, as they inform the remnants of the now dwindling human race that they in fact serve an abstract and almost spiritual galactic intelligence called the Overmind, which seeks to find civilizations across the universe who've evolved sufficiently enough to transcend psychically and assimilate within its greater being. Upon raising this new generation that has outgrown humanity, the rest of the human race is left to go extinct as they watch their post-human children reorganize their lives in preparation for the Overmind. The novel ends with the last human being remaining on Earth witnessing the arrival of the Overmind's cosmic force, and at the sight of his own species' extinction, the final man remarks a sense of peace and fulfillment at not just his life, but his entire species' finality, as the Earth is consumed and destroyed in this cosmic unification. But before connecting the story back to Powers of 10, it's important to have a bit of context behind Arthur C. Clarke and his flavor of science fiction. Throughout his writing, and especially within this book, Clarke shows a complex fascination with religious iconography, myths, and dynamics through the lens of 20th century rationalism. The Overlord's role as guardian angels are completely subverted when they reveal themselves to humanity with their demonic appearances. Their relationship with the Overmind as agents preparing for its arrival liken their dynamic to that of the Judeo-Christian God and his angels. And even the rhetoric of the final section of the book harkens to biblical verses. But this isn't to say that Clarke's fascination with religion is solely on Christianity. As many commentators have noted, the peaceful submission of mankind's doom seems much more in line with Buddhist principles, promoting acceptance of the impermanence of all things. Apart from that, Clarke's novel has the reader question the significance and motives behind conventional ideas of utopias and technological progress, since we see these two elements serve as ultimate dead ends for both the human race and the overlords. All of this is to say that Arthur C. Clarke is interested in far more than just the idea of mankind witnessing its own end, and instead wants to explore the cultural elements that may come into play and color this sort of narrative, which is a style we'll see in Hickman's writing for the final era of Powers of Ten. Returning to the far-off future of the Mutants, there are several parallels between Powers of Ten and Childhood's End that should seem immediately apparent, and some others that will recontextualize the core conflict at the heart of this era of Xmen. Right off the bat, both stories share the idea of humanity evolving beyond its former self, and growing into what can only be described as post-human through the advancements they've developed. Childhood's End attributes the evolution as organic through the apparition of parapsychic powers that have latently existed in mankind, while Powers of Ten attributes post-humanity with the artificiality of technological singularity. Apart from that, this race of post-mankind garners the attention of a vast and unknowable cosmic being, beyond conventional comprehension for the sake of joining with the abstract entity as a sort of glorious purpose. See the Phalanx and the Overmind. So then, by the cross-narrative relationships we have so far, it would seem that the only remaining parallel left is between the final human in Childhood's End and the final mutants in Powers of Ten. And this would make sense. Both parties are the last of their remaining species, and are left to bear witness to the extinction of their life, planet, and all that they once knew in the face of this manifested cosmic force. The only stark difference in this case is that while the last man in Childhood's End finds solace and peace in his death, Moira and Wolverine rebel against their extinction. Usually when an allusion to some famous piece of media is evoked and disrupted, like how Hickman does with Moira's resolve to refuse extinction, the divergence from the original source material is meant to communicate some larger message that the creator is trying to convey. But in Powers of Ten, it's pretty unclear what this larger message is supposed to be. On one hand, the divergence could be seen as something to condemn. The last man on Earth found peace and tranquility in coming to terms with the end of civilization, even though he knew he wouldn't go on to exist with the Overmind. But when we contrast this with Moira's desperate attempts to escape from the demise of mutantkind, her denial can seem colored in a childishness and selfishness that can make her look simple-minded by comparison. But on the other hand, this could also be seen as a critique of the original ending of Childhood's End. Yes, the final man on Earth found fulfillment with total demise, but this was also a man who grew in the lap of a utopia and a pacified global state. In contrast, mutantkind, as Moira emphasizes throughout the series, most never finds a state of tranquility that's even a fraction of Arthur C. Clarke's novel. And so, her rebellion against demise can be seen as a characteristic of the marginalized experience. Hickman doesn't really go out of his way to give the reader a clear sense of how they should feel about this divergence from the allusion source material. In general, Hickman's story is certainly filled with fascinating ideas, but he rarely goes so far as to organize them to communicate a cohesive message with these ideas. And his general silence on judgment is a recurring critique that I and many critics have had about his Xmen writing in general. There's almost an instinct to praise Moira's divergence, since she's clearly the main character of the story. But a lot of comic book readers feel the same way about a character like Rorschach from Watchmen. And as most any critical reader will tell you, Rorschach is not a character that is meant to be praised in any capacity. All in all, the only definitive takeaway that readers have from this allusion to childhood's end is that the experience, much like every other extinction event experience across Moira's 8 other lives, adds to her radical and ultimate conclusion on the future of mutantkind. That mutants always lose. While this analysis can sound somber in the face of the inescapable, with all the apocalyptic imagery and rhetoric on finality, I think it's an important reminder to consider the writer who's been communicating these ideas in the first place, Jonathan Hickman. Hickman's stories in Marvel Comics haven't exactly been a stranger to dystopia and disasters, namely his work on Avengers and New Avengers in the build-up to Secret Wars. Very similarly to how Hickman presents a technological demise to mutantkind as inevitable within the pages of Powers of 10, recall that he shared a far more catchier maxim surrounding the state of the multiverse in his previous Marvel project. Everything dies. While the road to Secret Wars saw tragedy after tragedy, from the moral sacrifices of virtuous men to the compromises of ethics amongst others, Hickman's writing saw the calculated erosion of faith amongst the stars of the Marvel Universe. But for as bleak and captivating as this dramatic catastrophe was, it's important to remember that Hickman did not, in fact, give in to the hopelessness that surrounded the pages of his story. For as often as the words "everything dies" was echoed and chanted, all of it became overshadowed by the final pages of Secret Wars, when we hear Reed Richards reflect upon how wrong he was to have been so cold and calculating about it all.
I used to believe in universal contraction, entropy, and the end of all things. Well, I've changed my mind. I'm letting go. Because now, I believe in expansion. I believe we endure. Don't you see? Everything lives.
As of this recording, Hickman's Xmen project seems to be rhyming rather closely to his road to Secret Wars. The heroes of our stories are made aware of a dystopian crisis looming within their future, and have been forced to compromise their core beliefs in hopes of averting these disasters for the greater good of all that they care about. But even despite their brilliant innovations and moral sacrifices, we still see bits and pieces of their looming calamity slipping through the cracks and manifesting as reminders that their efforts may very well be worthless. We're told outright that the proliferation of mutant hunting sentinels is a technological inevitability, we see that despite the efforts seen in House of X, the Nimrod protocol still goes online. And even more so, in a twist of classical Greek tragedy, Xavier and Magneto's efforts may have solidified the future they sought to prevent, since we're told that they've unintentionally left the cyborg completely empty of the humanity he once had. And now, as Hickman prepares for his next title in the X-Men lineup, Inferno, we're even given more hints and signs that this will only further put the mutant heroes of Krakoa under duress and shake their beliefs in their cause. While many readers celebrate the events of the Hellfire Gala these past few months, I still see it as another crack in Mutantkind's future, since it largely paves the way for Krakoa to become a mutant empire, something that the early days of the nation celebrated it would never be. But wherever this journey takes them, I think it's a fair argument to always hold out for hope for the downtrodden mutantkind through their darkest of moments. This has been Mel from New Comics. I hope you enjoyed the video.